As you can maybe see from some of my surroundings, hint, hint, I need to do some scrap management. And I thought maybe you'd benefit from a video dealing with this. Here's part of a backing. So I'll just get rid of this seam. Then what I do is fold the fabric. Since this has the selvage, I'm going to put it on this side. Then I grab my trusty Stripology ruler, and I'm working over here. I'm sorry for the glare. Get in a little closer. I'll line up any one of these lines on the fold of the fabric, so I won't have an elbow in my strips. Well, and I'm working around my stand for my camera, and I've been using a lot of 2.5-inch strips, so I'm just going to cut the 2.5-inch strips. So those are done, and I just discard this, and I'll just make sure the selvage is on the left of the zero line. Line up any line on the fold, and let's see, I think I'll do some 2-inch strips this time. I do have some projects that I save 2.5 and 2-inch strips, and even 1.5. And there's that piece is done, and I just stack them to the side. Then we'll have some pieces like this. So what do we do with that? Let me back up a little bit. Okay, since this, I'm just kind of seeing about the grain of the fabric, and since the narrower end is over here, and that's the selvage edge, I can see that here. I'm going to cut that off because that's too narrow anyway. Once again, I still line up that fold. Cut the selvage off. And 2.5, that's kind of narrow. I'm going to save 1.5 for now. And I'm just going to cut the pointy ends off these strips. And here's a pretty nice 1.5-inch strip. And we'll just make another one of those. 1.5. Where it tapers, I'll just cut that off so I don't have to store that. That's garbage. I'm just kind of looking at the grain line, trying to straighten it up a little bit. Here, this fold is on this side, so I'm going to line that up. And I'll just follow the stars as the 1.5. There's a stack of 1.5-inch strips. I'm just going to throw this. I'm also looking for 6.5-inch squares. So if I can get a 6.5-inch square, I'll take the bulk out of that first. For instance, in this piece, it's going to cut it kind of close. Even if I can get one out, it's vintage fabric. And it's better than nothing. I'm going to make a snowball quilt out of it, I think. Now I just line up one of the lines here. 6.5, 6.5. Okay, after I cut that 6.5-inch square, I moved the ruler a little bit, so I just realigned it, and I'm going to get a 2.5-inch strip out of there, and let's just do a 1.5. I fold the longer pieces of fabric on the table, several of them at a time. Then I lay my Stripology ruler so the fold is on any line. Some of the raw edges hanging past the 0. And I just kind of look to see what I can get out of that strip. So in this case, it's 1.5. So I will just cut that 1.5-inch strip. Then I will, looking at the shortcuts on the bottom, the stars are all 1.5 and the squares are 2.5. So that just helps me. I just go to the nearest one to see where I can get a 2.5-inch strip at least. So here's the 2.5 and 5. Then I just move this next one over. Here's the 7.5, and the other square is on the 10. I'm just looking at the squares, just saying the numbers to help you. If you don't have a Stripology ruler, if you want to try this out, to use your own ruler, you can pre-mark it. Here's 2.5, and here's a little bit left over. I can get a 1.5-inch strip out of there, so then I just cut that. So here's my 1-inch strip, and I'll just go between here so you can see. I'll just cut off that little edge. I have a stack over here of 1.5-inch strips. Here's 2.5. See the extra? I'll just cut that off so I don't have to store that. Put it on my 2.5-inch strip pile. You have to save strips according to the way you work. I use a lot of I have a lot of patterns anyway, to use 1.5 to 2.5-inch scraps, so that's what I save. Here's 3.5, 2.5, 1.5, and then I wasn't sure if I was going to save 2, so here's my 2-inch strips. And then if there was just a little bit, I cut squares. So I have a little pile of 1.5 and 2-inch squares. Later I'll show you some of the patterns I use with those. But this is just an idea to help you get started managing your scraps and getting them into a usable size for however you like to work. You can also save scraps according to, maybe you're saving up some pieces in order to make a scrappy quilt. So whatever size you need, that's the size you can cut from your scraps. If you're not going to use them, don't worry. Give them to somebody else. Don't think that you're wasting if you give them away. Some people just love to use scraps. After I made all my strips from scraps, I sort them into colors and then I store them. This is where I store my 2-inch strips. These drawers are pretty neat. They're the 12 by 12 Sterilite, and I just do them by colors. So I'll grab my blue ones and I'm just going to stick them in here. And of course, this isn't always so neat, but when I'm cutting, I usually just Here's my kind of my neutrals. I might just toss the piles in here for now, and then later on I'll sit down and sort them by colors, and then I just have stacks of squares here. And then if I need a certain color, I just come in here and grab the colors. And there's still quite a bit of room. Just squish them together, and there's still plenty of room. My 2.5-inch strips, I sort by color. These were blues and greens. I used quite a bit out of there for a project I'm working on now. And here is my 1.5-inch strips. I want to warn you not to keep buying more containers and putting scraps in. Here's kind of the red, white, and blue patriotic and neutral. So I have the reds, blacks, and some odd ones stored here. When your container gets full, that means you should make something with them. Don't just buy more and more containers and never make anything with them. The idea is to take these scraps and make something useful out of them. If you're not going to use the scraps, just let somebody else cut them and worry about them and make something else from them. If you don't enjoy this part of the process of making scraps, if you don't like anything about this, don't do it. Stay tuned for another series of videos where I show you what I do with some of these scraps.